What these guys don't know is I work for Nintendo. I've got my eye on you.
All right, hello, fellow netizens, and welcome again to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hey, I'm Phil Thomas, and I am still a video game newbie.
This is Elford Stephens, your gaming daddy.
I'm Andy Hunter, a longtime gamer, and now a longtime podcaster, too.
And I'm Kate. I really liked when Magikarp evolved into Gyarados when you hooked him into the waterfall in Pokemon Snap.
And we are back to finally end our long run at Pokemon-related fan projects. Recall last time, Nintendo sent takedown notices and cease and desist orders to the makers of both Pokemon Prism and Pokemon Uranium. So today, let's take a look at what the discourse is around these games. And we'll talk about, again, whether or not they were actually effective at achieving what they sought out to do. And I'm going to offer some of my thoughts on that. The legal notices left gamers with mixed feelings. There were, of course, some obvious cries of, fuck Nintendo, one of my favorite being a poster commenting on a December 21st, 2016 Ars Technica article on the cease and desist against Prism, with the straightforward response of, quote, what a bunch of dicks, they couldn't have done this before he spent 8 years on it, end quote. Meanwhile, another person started a thread in the Pokemon Prism subreddit the same day with the title, quote, Nintendo is finally dead to me, end quote. To be fair, few doubted the company's prerogative to defend its intellectual property. However, more than a few felt the backlash to Uranium and Prism was an unfair response by Nintendo that punished some of Pokemon's most dedicated fans. As one post shared on the same thread said, quote, I don't even see the point in taking down a free mod for a 15-year-old game that doesn't even distribute any of the copyrighted material. Nobody gains anything out of it. The players don't, the developers don't, and Nintendo doesn't. It sucks because I like the things Nintendo creates, but now I'll always have this at the back of my head, and it leaves a very sour aftertaste, end quote. Now, something I need to point out with that, too, is that a common practice, particularly in the ROM hacking community, so if we're making modified code that's going to be applied to an existing retail game, you know, like Red, like Pokemon Crystal in the case of Prism, is that they never host on their websites, they never share fully hacked ROMs. No one ever does that because there's always the concern that they're going to be facing some kind of legal challenge from Nintendo for sharing ROMs illegally. So everybody knows that. And so what they generally do is people will share the hacked file and they'll leave it up to people to find the ROM wherever you get it on the internet to find that ROM for their respective game. And then you go to the development team's website and they'll usually have a patching program where basically you go to a part of their website, you upload the ROM, you upload the file for the hack, and it compiles them together into a usable ROM. So like in the case of Prism, it turns into a .gbc file, which is something that can be read by a Game Boy Color emulator. And this is something that a lot of other ROM hacks have done, not just Pokemon Prism does it. And so the fact that they went at Pokemon Prism in particular left some people in the ROM hacking community a bit concerned because some people tried to argue that it set a bad precedent for the ROM hacking community as a whole because it meant that Nintendo was now going after actively the code that people were making. Because there's an argument that's been made, and we talked about it briefly in the, and we talked about why people do these things, is that some people will argue that all this stuff that they add on to the existing ROM belongs to the people who made it. So the developers of the ROM hack, that's their code. And basically Nintendo's coming in saying, this code's ours too. And so people try to argue that the code itself is a unique intellectual property. So, for example, another commenter in that Ars Technica article that covered the cease and desist notice on December 21st, 2016, declared when they heard about the cease and desist, quote, what? No, that's bullshit. You don't have copyright protection for code someone else wrote. I could take that patch and apply it to another game just the same. If he was distributing a modified ROM, that's one thing. Distributing a different file is completely different. Total bullshit, end quote. And we have some technically oriented people. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Phil or Kate, on this kind of defense.
I don't know if that's going to hold up in court. I mean, sure. I mean, you know, all things being even, you could argue that, but I don't really know if it's up to a programmer to determine what would hold up in court legally. So I don't know.
Well, what if we did this as an intellectual exercise? Because we know that some of the ROM hacks are straightforward, like text replacing. So what if I sold, a ROM hack of a book, on physical sheets that were mostly transparent, that had certain like words printed, and that had instructions like this sheet, place on page 12 of your book, and it will line up in such a way that certain words would be replaced. And like that's all that I'm selling. I think that doesn't sound illegal. Like as long as I'm not. I mean, I presume there are certain things I would have to like. I can't on the packaging say compatible with Twilight or something like that. But people who know like the same thing as like Rifftrax. Like they're able to sell their own separate.
Like that. It's film criticism. Like that's right what it says on the tin. Like this is like educational, or it's like film critique or whatever. Like there are commentaries, if that's what you're talking about, including the ones that have the actual video. Although usually they only package the video if it's like outside of copyright, like Night of the Living Dead, for instance. But like the commentaries where it's like sync up to your totally legal copy of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice or whatever. Yeah, they're not selling the movie. And that's not illegal, but because they're not selling anything that they didn't make, and also what they are selling to go with that thing is, it's part of what is considered fair use. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, basically, if it's, first of all, I agree with you also, Phil. Like, as a person who writes software, it's not for me to decide what's legal or illegal. And going back to the controlled digital lending thing earlier, and again, I don't know if pause for editing, because I don't know if we want to do the episode. We legit had conversations as developers while we were implementing controlled digital lending at the beginning of the pandemic of, are we going to get in trouble? Are we going to be the ones they slap the handcuffs on if it's decided in the Supreme Court that this is illegal, or not Supreme Court, wherever, you know what I mean? Like if someone decides, if some publisher comes after us, are they going to go after us, the developers who are developing and deploying the code to deliver the assets? Or are they going to go after OGC, the Office of General Counsel, who say, you know what, we're fine. Generally speaking, those of us who are doing the doing are just like, we're just doing what we're told in this regard. Like we defer to our leadership, who defers to the Office of General Counsel, who defer to their lawyers, and they're the ones who know what we're talking about. I feel like the whole not a lawyer thing comes up a lot in this podcast series, and especially right now. And it's like, yeah, hey, look, I'm not a lawyer. So, talk to someone who is.
I, as a hypothetical 16-year-old who's developing their Pokemon Fire Red ROM hack, is well qualified to say this is legal because I say it is. And like we've talked about in previous episodes, the kinds of legal defenses that people will make for this, things like fair use and even things like parody. And like, I'm not saying that any of those are valid things because I am 100% not a lawyer. And I mean, you can go back to the question of like market harm and things like that. Does the fact that they are modding a game that Nintendo put out at that point 16 years ago, is it creating a kind of market harm for them? Do they face any kind? Again, the argument could go either way. Nintendo is well within the rights to defend their IP, and more than a few people talked about the fact that they can do this, and other people trying to defend the idea of like, this person put all of this work into it, and they're just adding it onto something. Like I loved my brain also went to Rifftrax when you started to talk about that. So I'm glad you brought that up. And like you could make that argument. Again, not a lawyer. We'll see if our esteemed judges on the U.S. Supreme Court, what they think about ROM hacking. I'm sure Justice Clarence Thomas has lots of strong opinions about what the original founding fathers would do with Pokemon Radical Red, but we'll let the courts decide that.
So, like, let's talk about the Rifftrax thing for a second. So, what you could argue is that the Rifftrax exists first and then is pulled in to another entity and built on top of. Like, that's the argument here. But it's the opposite with ROM hacking. The original creative existed first, and then you created something to alter that. And in Andy's analogy, it's like there's an overlay onto a book, which actually is a really savvy analogy. If you can take those overlays and put them on other books and arrive at reasonably intelligible products, then I think in the spirit of the law, you could claim that that's your intellectual property, because you can make the argument that it's not designed to alter specific books. But if it's clearly designed to alter one specific book, then that argument falls apart. That's my opinion.
Just to build on that too, I years ago I visited an accessibility library in DC, and they had, among other things, a really great collection. Again, years and years ago, they had a great collection of videos that were made accessible for blind people. They were VHS tapes, and it's not awesome nowadays, but a lot more DVDs and Blu-rays do have accessible audio tracks for people with visual impairments to watch movies. That was very rare for a while. And there was, I want to say it was through the NFB. I could totally be wrong about that though. But there was some organization that made accessible audio tracks and recorded it, like overlaid them over existing films and made VHSs, and they were put into this lending library. No one was making any real money off this. This was just to make videos accessible. And the organization that made them was shut down by various film studios, because what they were doing was kind of what you're saying, Phil. It's like they're taking something that already exists and they're building on top of it. And, you know, in this case, like the intention was good. And in terms of profit, like no one was looking to make their life's fortune. No one was trying to do anything wrong. They were trying to broaden the audience, if anything else, which I think is what we're getting at with a lot of these ROM hacks and things. Like, what are you trying to do? What is your intention? I want to continue to enjoy the game that I could no longer enjoy because, you know, my console doesn't work anymore, or I want to show it to my kids who, you know, they're of a new generation, and again, they don't have access to the things that I had access to as a kid, or I have these new ideas and the studios aren't making new intellectual property for me. So that's why I'm trying to do this. Like, in other words, like, and again, Kevin, I'm interested. Two things. One, I'm not under the impression that any of these cases that you're bringing up are people who were legitimately like just trying to make a quick buck, trying to make money off of this. It was creativity and it was a love of the property. And the second question I just want to ask is if there was any rhyme or reason to who they went after versus who they didn't. Because per our conversation in the last episode about like Escape from Tomorrow and stuff, where it's like, there are sometimes it's like, who cares? Some of these people, it does seem like you were just picking on people, you know what I mean? And making an example of someone, but why them as opposed to someone else?
I'm glad you asked those questions. Now, for the first question, I will tell you, we are going to talk about some people who did try to make a quick buck off these kinds of things. That's going to be near the end. But I promise we'll go back to that. As for why they targeted these, and I can tell you probably a good reason why they targeted Uranium and Prism in particular. They did get a lot of attention. They got a lot of public exposure. Uranium was picked up by a lot of the gaming press, so there was a lot of publicity for these. Whether or not they sought for that, I don't think they deliberately sought that kind of publicity. Speaking myself, I don't think they were deliberately trying to pick a fight with Nintendo, but I think they got amplified in such a way because, as we talked about in the past, 2016 was a really big year for Pokemon. A lot of people were looking for new Pokemon content. And people came across the fact that, you know, Uranium dropped. It had been in development for such a long time. And a lot of people drew to the fact that, like, it looks pretty good for what it is. It's been in development for a long time. It's coming out during the midst of Pokemon Go fever. It dropped a month after Pokemon Go came out. And so it got a lot of attention. And then Prism also got a pretty big bump, particularly like in October when they start promoting through Twitch Plays Pokemon. So it's particularly a couple of high profile games, I would argue with that. Same thing with AM2R, because AM2R also got a lot of press coverage, got tons of downloads. And so, like, it was, again, the fact that it went up on Nintendo's radar. And I think this was a case, it was the squeaky wheel getting the most grease kind of thing, or the biggest nail getting tamped down kind of thing. I think that was probably what the motivation was between these specific projects. You could make the argument that 1.5 million downloads of Uranium a couple of months before Sun and Moon come out. You could, again, if you're Nintendo, you could make the argument that this is a competing thing, that someone's going to play this free game as opposed to the one we're actually putting out for the 3DS. So I think that's the argument they're making here. But I'm glad you brought up the question about IPs and competition, because some people watching the response to Uranium and Prism hope that the pushback to these two games being targeted by Nintendo would inspire a whole bunch of hungry young devs to create competing IP in the vein of Pokemon, to like make their own version of Pokemon, citing the likes of Undertale and Stardew Valley as successful indie titles heavily inspired by mainline retail games like Earthbound, like Harvest Moon. As one user commented on a Reddit thread following Uranium's takedown, observed, quote, "Preface, I love Pokemon. It's a wonderful franchise, and I will possibly always play at least one of every gen's entry. Nevertheless, I must say, shit like this is what will spawn a legitimate third-party game that gets massively popular on PC primarily, not necessarily on the same Nintendo platform, obviously. We have, for example, Harvest Moon with no PC representation, until some fine lasses and lads got around and put up Stardew Valley. While not Harvest Moon, it definitely appears to be influenced by that series. Point of what I'm saying, eventually some group will get together their own IP, albeit very similar to Pokemon, and push it out there, either for free or for an indie price range. Again, love Pokemon. Hell, love Nintendo. But I also love the community much more. They're what drive the games to still be released periodically. I look forward to what may potentially come from the community again in the future. But I'm happy to have snabbed this game and played it. Speaking of Uranium, it definitely is inspiring to see a fan-built rendition on PC, end quote. So we'll go and make our own damn Pokemon game. We'll call it Pokémon, where you collect different forms of Pocky, and you compete to make the most delicious Pocky.
Gotta crotch them all.
I actually did play a game called Nexomon Extinction, which is a Pokemon-like, you're catching monsters and battling them, and they can evolve, and there's type matchups. And it was enjoyable. The problem that any would-be indie or third-party person wanting to get into the Pokemon space has is that Pokemon has that great hook that you can play a game just on your own, but you can also battle your friends and you can trade with your friends, and you can then carry your Pokemon from one game forward into the next game. And so that any company that's just making one standalone game, it's just so hard to, I think, go against that entrenched, or at least for me, because one of the appeals of because there was another Nexomon game too, and I thought, oh well, would I want to play that? And I don't know, I played one. I'm probably fine. As opposed to when a new Pokemon game comes out, I'm like, I'm interested in seeing the tweaks they make to the formula. I'm interested in seeing how my old Pokemon do if I bring them forward into the new game, new moves they can learn. So basically, there's a whole ecosystem around Pokemon, which a competing game would have to work really hard to create for themselves.
And I mean, the challenge, I think, particularly with a game like Pokemon, is there's a lot of specific set of mechanics that are part of that any competing games, it's like Pokemon, but it's going to be hard to disassociate. Like Undertale is a counterpoint of that. Undertale was definitely inspired by Earthbound, but it has definitely a lot of its own mechanics and style that make it distinct from Earthbound, that you're not going to say this is just Earthbound. I think that's a tricky thing with Pokemon, because you have to involve the battling, the monster collecting, things like that. I can think of two comparable examples. One is this series called Telefang. Telefang is a Japanese series. We mentioned it briefly when we talked about ROM hacks. When we mentioned Pokemon Diamond and Pokemon Jade for the Game Boy Color were ROM hacks of this series called Telefang, where that is like Pokemon, but instead of catching monsters, you meet them and you can call them on your phone to have them battle for you. And there's lots of neat little ins and outs of those mechanics. If you're in a cave, you can't call other monsters to come help you because you don't get cell reception in there. So there are ways to do that. And the other one I was thinking of when you mentioned a portable kind of mobile kind of ways, like Pocket Mortys, for example, the Rick and Morty game that's just basically reskinned Pokemon, except it's Morty, where they've got I think 3 Morty types and all of the Mortys are involved in that way. So that's a version. And that's basically just you might be able to argue that one is a parody game. That one is pretty damn close to just being a Pokemon game. Albeit a not necessarily very good Pokemon game. So people are talking about this as trying to make some sort of variation. People are infinitely creative. Maybe someone will do some version of this. I don't think it'll ever come to the level of Pokemon. I'm willing to be proven wrong about that. But on top of all that, all these defenses of Uranium and Prism in light of Nintendo doing this, that of course isn't to say that Cool Boy Man and Involuntary Twitch's teams attracted universal support among the game community. As we discussed a while back, the validity of fan projects in general is a really complicated subject, where some people question their decision to appropriate material from an existing IP rather than spend all those years, for example, making their own original games. We've talked about people saying why did you spend all this time when you could have made a retail game that you'd be able to make money on? For example, the RPG Maker community is really divided over fan games that use RPG Maker. And as we said, Pokemon games like Uranium is an RPG Maker XP-based game, because there are some people who see that as delegitimizing the engine, because you're just basically making this to make knockoff games. So there are people who push back and say that they should not have been doing this in the first place. And there are also some in the fan community that kind of saw Prism and Uranium as a cautionary tale of what happens when a game gets too big. As we've talked about, people say it's okay to promote your game, but if it gets too big, this might happen to it. This is an example, you shouldn't promote it too much because there's always a chance Nintendo can come in. And also other people tried to say things like that they were bringing in passive income, either from things like YouTube ad revenue, website ad revenue. Apparently Uranium had a Patreon. So people were making money, and it's this is another example. Don't do that. If you're going to make your own ROM hack or fan game, don't do this kind of stuff. Became one of the lessons out of Uranium and Prism. And speaking of popularity, Some blame the mainstream gaming press, as will happen in pretty much any video game related debate. We're making our way closer to Gamergate, aren't we? Calling out sites like Kotaku, Polygon, and GameSpot for giving Prism and Uranium too much coverage and thus putting them on Nintendo's radar. For example, Angelina Bonilla of GameSkinny laid the blame for Pokemon Uranium's demise at the feet of mainstream gaming news sites, citing the increased exposure as what attracted Nintendo's attention, writing in an August the 14th, 2016 article, quote, "If you thought I was going to blame the copyright laws, I'll say that they're part of the real problem. But talking about them will solve nothing other than adding kindling to a fire that has been burning for decades now. Nintendo has every right to defend their intellectual property. That's how capitalism works, you see. But they're far from omnipresent. It was unlikely they knew about this game prior to this, for they would have smothered it in its crib. Game journalists, however, we were the ones that turned Pokemon Uranium into the law to be executed. Here's the thing. When there's a fan project of a game in development and you do press coverage of it, it'll probably get shut down. We have seen this time and again. Do press coverage on the Chrono Trigger Resurrection project, Square Enix shuts it down. Bulbasaur Planters, Nintendo shuts it down. I don't know what that one is. My Little Pony, Fighting is Magic, Hasbro shuts it down. Do you see a pattern here yet? I know that there's more to it than just press coverage. Companies should just allow fans to do things like this. But newsflash, we live in a capitalist society. When it comes to these guys, as much as people want to take down the bourgeoisie to free their games, okay, that's not going to happen anytime soon. For now, we need to do these projects a favor and not report on them, end quote. The best way to share your love of games like Pokemon Uranium is to keep that to yourself.
Well, I guess what she's trying to say is snitches get stitches, you know?
Or snitches cause the people they're snitching on to get stitches, at least.
Regardless of how people thought about this, many felt it was a tragedy to see it combine 17 years of hard work between the two projects go to waste and sought to do something about it. Almost immediately after Involuntary Twitch announced the takedown, many fans started sharing download links from other pages where people could get their own copy of Pokemon Uranium. On top of that, there were countless write-ups, reviews, and Let's Plays of Uranium that started describing it as the banned game Nintendo doesn't want you to play. So you mentioned a while back, Kate, when we talked about Escape from Tomorrow, is there possibly a thing where people are going to see this as a game? That's exactly what happened to Uranium. So, for example, I'll bring it up real fast so I can get the title exactly right. Game Theory, MatPat, the game theorists, they did a Let's Play of Pokemon Uranium after the DMCA takedowns where Involuntary Twitch took the game down, in which they described as banned Pokemon Uranium fan game. And if you search online now for Uranium, chances are you're going to hear it described as the banned Pokemon game or the game that Nintendo doesn't want you to play. So they end up getting that kind of attention, which end up having the reverse effect of making more people pay attention. It's like, I need to download this game because Nintendo is going to take it away from me. Meanwhile, in the case of Pokemon Prism, the day of the December 21st takedown, a user posted a download link to the most recent build of the game on 4chan with an accompanying post on the Pokemon Prism subreddit with both the download link and a statement that likely encapsulated many of the feelings of its fans. Quote, "Fuck it. 8 years won't go to trash. Here's the game," end quote. All of this goes back to a point I made in our previous episode when we talked about the history of RPG Maker in the West. Once something's on the internet, it's basically there forever. Even with all their resources, Nintendo can only do so much against legions of users anonymously posting and sharing download links for the likes of Pokemon Prism, Pokemon Uranium, AM2R, or any other fan project that gets in their legal crosshairs. Sure, you can threaten the makers or their internet service providers or the web hosting service, but what can you do about everyone else who downloaded it? So long as at least one person holds the file, that person could anonymously share it online where other people can access it and share it over and over again ad infinitum. In some respects, fighting fan projects, especially after they've been released, is like the gaming legal equivalent of battling a Hydra. Cut off one head, and thousands take its place with usernames like Gardevoir Lover 69 and Snorlax is my daddy. And thus, on a certain level, you could sum up Nintendo's response to Prism and Uranium, to borrow a Pokemon term, as Nintendo used legal threats. It wasn't very effective.
Phil, when you use a move that is not good, like if you're trying to use a fire type move against a water type Pokemon, the game will say, "Oh, you used this fire move. It's not very effective." It's the game's way of saying it did half as much damage as if it were used against a neutral Pokemon.
Yeah, you idiot. Trying to fire move with a water type. What are you thinking?
Yes, what was I thinking? Because in Monster Hunter, you probably want to use fire weapons against like water element monsters because they're probably weak to it, right? In Monster Hunter, if you're going up against like a monster that hangs out in the water and squirts water at people, you probably want to use fire against it because it would be weak to fire. I just assumed that all video games were exactly the same.
No. In Pokemon, fire weak against water,
and fighting can beat darkness. I think that's right. I always mess with the dark type.
Fighting is super effective against dark type, and apparently it's because in Japan the fighting type is something closer to like hero type or something, and so it's like yes, heroes are good against those who lurk in shadows and use underhanded tactics. That's the reasoning there.
So on top of all that, legal threats did not cease development on either game. And fans took up the work of its original creators, thumbing their anonymous noses at Nintendo's legal threats. The same day that Involuntary Twitch announced she and her team were shutting down Uranium, a group of the game's fans declared that they had taken the reins of the project. The new team launched a new website and Discord, and they've been working on it ever since. The most recent build as of this recording is version 1.2.4, which they dropped in October 2018. And the same thing happened for Prism. Not long after Cool Boy Man walked away from the ROM hack, a group of fans formed their own studio called Rainbow Devs and announced the revival of Pokemon Prism with a January the 30th, 2017 tweet that simply said, "Let's get this started." Since then, Rainbow Devs has posted 2 new versions. As of this recording, the most recent build is version 0.94, which dropped on June the 5th, 2017. While that was nearly 6 years ago, members of Rainbow Devs will periodically appear on the game's subreddit to remind everyone they're still working on the game. For example, when asked about the status of the ROM hack, a member of the dev team posted on November 29th, 2022, quote, "We're still working on it. The latest update is somewhat complicated internally, so it's taking a bit of time to sort out. Sorry," end quote. They're also apparently working on another remake of Pokemon Brown, the Pokemon Red ROM hack that kind of started all of this stuff. This is also the case of a lot of the other fan projects we've covered. For example, people are still working on Streets of Rage remake, and the most recent build of the game is version 5.2, which released on November the 16th, 2020. And if you recall, that was that fan remake/sequel of Streets of Rage that Sega put out a takedown notice against after it came out. So they've been still working on it. And both PokeNet and Pokemon Essentials, those 2 things I talked about, the MMO and the toolkit for RPG Maker XP, those are still available online too. Now, with all that, part of me wonders if everything went according to plan. Nintendo's timing on these projects, especially on Uranium, is interesting. They could have taken the approach of, for example, Square Enix with Chrono Resurrection, smothering the project in its crib well before it was ready for release. The same goes for Streets of Rage Remake, whose team apparently notified Sega after it came out. Nintendo and Sega had to know that once these games reached the internet, there was little to no way to completely stifle them. Is it possible, this is where I put my conspiracy theory hat on, is it possible then that game companies sometimes look to fan projects to gauge market interest in a franchise? Was it a coincidence that the year after Nintendo took action against AM2R, that they released an official Metroid 2 remake in Metroid Samus Returns? We may never know. It's also possible I'm reading too much into this. 2016 was the 20th anniversary of Pokemon, with Nintendo serving up many different official ways for people to consume their IP. It was in their legal best interest to defend their intellectual property and crowd out any potential competition, fan-made or otherwise, especially when the Pokemon brand had so much exposure between the anniversary and the popularity of Pokemon Go.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
To your previous question about like market engagement, is there anything that you've seen in your research that would lead you to believe that perhaps that was happening?
I would never know the case of that. Nintendo's made no statement about that, that's for sure.
But I mean, have other like journalists thought about this or put stuff out there? I don't know. It's like, did this just come straight from your noggin, or is there other stuff that leads you to presuppose that? I'm just wondering.
I'm just spitballing here. I may be overthinking this in the sense that it just might be that Nintendo wasn't aware of these things until they got all the press attention when they came out. Because like the likes of Kotaku and IGN didn't really cover Uranium, although Kotaku did an article years and years before this on Uranium until after the game dropped. So it's possible they weren't really aware of it and how big it was until the coverage happened. So that's possible too. It might just be that was when they first noticed it. And again, because Nintendo doesn't go after every single attempt to appropriate its IP, just like all the other game companies. So it just might have been this was a big thing where all of a sudden it got a lot of downloads. And so that might have been the reason. As for my speculation that it might be, market testing, there's two things. One, they've never made any public statement about that. And number two, as far as I can tell, like in the case of Uranium and Prism, there's not really like a lot of features that appear in those games that ended up being integrated into other mainstream Pokemon games. So I think this is more a situation of this thing got popular, it's using our IP, and we need to shut this down.
So there's a part of me, perhaps the overly optimistic, naive part of me, that wants to believe that, most of the people who work at big companies like Sega and Nintendo like and care about video games themselves. And given the choice between, killing something the very instant somebody tweets, I'm thinking about making this, versus letting them work on it and then getting out there, understanding that once it's on the internet, it's out there forever, but you can still then assert your copyright claim just because you have to, because if you let too many of these projects go by, like we talked about in previous episodes, you're unwittingly building the legal case that you haven't been defending your copyright. And then suddenly like a big, like why you see, commercials that talk about Kleenex or Band-Aid, they will specifically say Kleenex brand tissues and Band-Aid brand bandages. Like they're trying to make these terms non-generic. And so like, I like to believe that in some cases they're like, this is neat that somebody cares about Pokemon enough that they're doing this. If it gets big enough, we have to eventually say, hey, kids, get off my lawn. But why not let the AM2R guy create a finished game that he can put out in his portfolio or something like that? Now, that might be Pollyanna of me.
No, I think that you have a really good point there. And I think that one thing you're making me think of here is there is some distance between the people who work at Nintendo, who develop the IPs, who write the code or who design the characters or everything in between, who are really invested in the product they're putting out and the good it does in the world. And what we're seeing here is, and this is true of any major organization where money is being made, there's going to also be a department essentially that controls finances and legal action. And they are typically so far removed from the value that is being delivered to the world by the product that like, they don't care, then it's like, no, this is just a person who really loves it and they're doing a good thing. And, it's not going to break the bank, but what they care about is like, but what could happen? What could break the bank? Or just their bottom line, their day-to-day concerns, which are not motivated by the same. And I will disagree. I don't think it's Pollyanna. Andy, I agree. I think it's more just like, we like this positivity, right? Like, it's like, and they're like, you like this? Fine, cool. I don't care. Here's my job, right? And it tends to come across as brutal when we get to see it.
Yeah, and I know there is a thing in trademark law in particular that if you don't periodically defend your trademark, it can wither away to become more of like Kleenex, like Band-Aid, where it becomes kind of like a generic brand. And Nintendo's not in the business of making Pokemon a generic brand for anything.
But I'm sorry just to interject, but isn't it interesting? Because, let me play my Nintendo, and that, like, it could be anything. It could be a Sega Genesis, right? I mean, like that was kind of a thing for a while.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because for a long time, Nintendo would put out corporate material and advertising material that discouraged people from calling all video games Nintendos. They were very aware of that. They were very aware of the thought. They did not want Nintendo to become a generic term for a video game, that we don't want this being called a Nintendo for that exact reason. But yeah, so, and I mean, again, I might be reading too much into that whole idea that maybe they're trying to gauge this a little bit, because, I mean, it is in their legal best interest to defend their intellectual property, crowd out potential competition, fan-made or otherwise, and they do have to occasionally defend their trademark legally. That being said, I'm sure realistically the company was at little to no financial risk of Uranium or Prism, and to say nothing of the countless other Pokemon fan projects. Again, I'm going to say this for the 1,000th time, not an endorsement of these kinds of things, but they're just, realistically, they're probably not taking money. If anything, they're probably encouraging and enhancing that brand. Again, that's an argument that could be made about it. I mean, another interpretation could be the sort of legal corporate trademark defense kind of argument, which you brought up, Kate, basically, is that another interpretation you can take is that this is kind of Nintendo metaphorically pounding its chest, reminding everyone who's really in charge of the Pokemon IP. And then after that, everyone goes about their business for another couple of years. And that maybe in another couple of years, some other project will get some attention and they'll do this again. In kind of a weird way, everyone kind of won in this story. Nintendo asserted their dominance over the Pokemon IP, and I'm sure their lawyers got paid too. Both Pokemon Prism and Pokemon Uranium are still out there on the internet for anyone who wants them, and the makers of both games came away without getting sued. Like, all in all, it seems like everybody, Nintendo, Cool Boy Man, Involuntary Twitch, and Pokemon, it's like everybody came up Millhouse on this one.
I thought I was the only one.
A pain I know all too well.
So, any thoughts so far? I feel like I've been kind of dominating a lot of the conversation. If I want to chime in, but now we're going to start kind of winding down. I've got one small controversy I'm going to talk about, and we're also going to talk about, like, are these games any good?
Maybe this is a little off topic, but you made me think about trademark names, with Nintendo not wanting their name Nintendo to be synonymous with video game. And I thought about Band-Aids. And I thought about the fact that a lot of people who say the word Band-Aid for first aid don't realize that Band-Aid is actually a brand. And it makes sense. Yeah, once you allow every single cartridge with a digital game on it to be called a Nintendo, suddenly the brand loses its value. Never thought about that before.
Could you imagine like an alternate reality where Nintendo did become a generic brand for video games, where like Sony's putting out its new Nintendos and Sega's putting out its new Nintendos and Square Enix is putting out its new Nintendos? It's a weird thing to think about. But yeah, there's a whole thing in the, like, reading a lot of primary sources, particularly in like the 80s and the 90s, really late 1980s into the 1990s, like the stuff about the panic over violent video games is like a lot of people who don't really know any better who are just calling them Nintendos. I know when I was growing up, my mom called them Nintendos.
Well, I mean, do you think everybody referring to Band-Aids as Band-Aids hurts or helps Band-Aid sales? I would venture to guess that it probably helps a lot. So who's to say everybody calling every video game console a Nintendo resulted in market harm? Maybe that would double their sales. Who knows?
Maybe, but I guess, you know, like I feel like there are some parts of the country where, or I know for sure there are some parts of the country where just every soda is called a Coke. And so, you know, if I walk into a restaurant and say, hey, can I get a Coke? And the server is like, sure, yeah. What do you want, Pepsi or Coke? And I'm like, oh yeah, give me a Pepsi. Like Coke's not getting any money from that. Or if I,
what do you want, a Sprite, a Dr. Pepper, or a Coke? So yeah,
or if, you know, my partner is going to the store and I say, oh yeah, we need some Band-Aids, and then they buy the generic. You know, Band-Aid is not helped by, like, if it gets to the point where you're no longer looking for the name brand, like aspirin was originally a name brand and now it's a generic because they didn't do a good job protecting it. So, you know, when you go out and buy aspirin, maybe you're buying the Bayer brand, which might have been the original, or maybe you're buying the store brand, or maybe you're buying the Merck brand or the Johnson & Johnson brand. So I think it might be able to work out in their favor, but I can certainly also imagine ways that it doesn't.
And you make two good points there, pharmaceuticals and soda pop. So if you think about Coke, you were to go to a restaurant and you say, I want a Coke, and they serve you RC Cola, and you're perfectly fine with that, then Coca-Cola is really losing out because you just want cola and you don't care, because they do taste differently, but they are something similar, and you stop caring about it, then Coca-Cola does lose it out. With pharmaceuticals, there is actually kind of a push trying to have people purchase generics and assume that they are the same as the trademark, the original drug. And so with pharmaceuticals, you have certain people that will have poor responses to the generic. Some people could have allergic reactions to one formulary that's different from the original. So you do have some changes even there, some issues that you run into when you have people assuming that a trademark name is a standard for all of the different medications that are somewhat similar, because they can't be exactly the same. Well, they try to make them, but
I can't believe we came out on the side of defending Nintendo.
Strange bedfellows we've made this series.
And Coca-Cola.
Oh God, what have we become?
Well, you know what? I think it's because we learned that everybody does it. I went into this thinking that Genesis does what Nintendo don't, but it turns out Sega do the same as Nintendo do.
Are you okay?
For unrelated reasons, I'm having a stroke, but I'm
All right. So with all that in mind, since you can still play them despite the takedown notices and the cease and desist letters, what do people think about these games? And let's start with Uranium. Reviews are generally positive, with many players viewing it as a refreshing take on the Pokemon formula. Positives include the new Fakemon, the game's attempt at a mature, for Pokemon at least, story, and the game's visual style. Negatives included the game's steep difficulty curve and occasional bugs and polish issues. For example, some reviewers noted missing attack animations and issues with the sound mixing. Uranium's plot is also a mixed bag among some other players. For example, there's a late game twist that you can see coming a mile away. Pokemon Prism, meanwhile, has also gained a largely positive reception among fans, and positives include the game's sprite design as well as innovative new ideas such as the side-scrolling sections, areas where you can play as Pokemon, and for the most part, the Pokemon selection, although several viewed the Dragonite evolutionary line as a strange omission, giving parts of the game's story that I won't spoil here. Negatives include the game's steep difficulty curve compared to the mainstream Pokemon games, and that's, again, kind of consistent among a lot of fan projects related to Pokemon. They tend to be harder than the originals, and sometimes the difficulty curve can kind of be inconsistent. In addition to that is the lack of any real post-game elements after you beat the Elite Four. However, I will add that more than a few people have given the team the benefit of the doubt, because people have acknowledged that the game's not finished yet. That this isn't a 1.0 version. So people are kind of willing to hold judgment, but I thought I'd make a point about that. Another criticism of Prism is that some of these new features appear kind of half-baked. So for example, there's a part very early in the game where you can play as a Pokemon, but apparently it only comes up like one or two more times throughout the rest of the game. So it's not really very well followed through on, is another criticism people have of it. And some people also, it adds a couple of new types. It adds wood, sound, and gas type Pokemon. And apparently they're unbalanced. They're not really well balanced with the mainline types. And in preparation for this episode, I actually played both games. I will say in advance, I didn't play them for very long. I played up to the first gym in Uranium, and I played up to the second gym in Prism.
So you held on to each for under 24 hours, it sounds like, and then deleted it.
Oh, absolutely. Nintendo, that's what I did.
Did you beat them after midnight?
All of this was happening in a dream. This is all satire. So I'll start with Uranium. The visuals are awesome. It does look really good. It's really impressive the way it looks, given it is a fan game. It's got a really polished interface. So they based it on a DS game, and they managed to make the battle interface really polished despite being only on one screen. That's pretty cool, because in Platinum, you had a second screen for all of your battle options, like your item, your attacks, and all stuff. They have it all on one screen, and it's pretty clean. The music is also really good. There's some really nice remixes of the mainline songs and some good original tracks. The sound effects are kind of less polished, though. Like, for example, the roar for the fire starter is literally just someone going, which is kind of funny. And again, there's kind of a homespun charm to that, because again, this was mostly developed by a small handful of kids who made this. The Fakemon designs are imaginative, although some of them have kind of like an off-brand soda kind of look to them. They're in the style, but they don't look quite right. There are also a couple technical things. I know some animation hiccups. So like your player's running animation gets kind of janky when you run. Some missing battle animations, like the move Mud Slap just had a generic like impact move, so it wasn't actually rendered for that. I also once had this one really weird glitch where the music didn't load, but only the sound effects did, which made it really awkward. So it's like you hear walking sounds, you hear the cries and everything. That's how I noticed that the yell was just like a person yelling, because it's something you don't notice when the music is playing, but it's very obvious when it is. But I reloaded the game and it worked fine. Also, the difficulty is higher than mainline games. Be prepared to do a lot of grinding, especially before gym battles. And pro tip, Steel-type Pokemons are your friends in the early game. And given what I've heard about the late game, they're friends there too, because, they're immune to nuclear type, or they're less effective with nuclear type. So overall, I had a good time playing. I may go back to it. Prism, meanwhile, I love the visuals. I'm a sucker for Gen 2. I've been playing a lot of Pokemon Silver, and so this is based on Crystal. So I love that style. So it was good for me. The music is good. It's, again, my favorite generation. So I like the music, and they remix a lot of the tracks that were in the original games. They added animations when the battle starts. So they do like little actions before the battle starts, which is neat. They're nice little quality of life improvements. So, for example, every attack tells you whether or not it's a physical or special attack, which is good. The design of the towns are also pretty imaginative. And the game overall makes a good use of the visual style. That being said, sometimes the levels are a little too big. The dungeons in particular are a little too complicated. There's one early on in the game that a lot of players complain about, that it's too big, it's too convoluted. It gives you options to go into whole other dungeons that are late game dungeons. So like you shouldn't have that. There's a reason why dungeons are straightforward in most Pokemon games. And on top of that, the encounter rate I feel like is higher than usual. So not only is it easy to get lost in these dungeons, but like every 3 steps, you're going to have a random battle. So pro tip, bring repels when you go in dungeons. They got a little annoying. But overall, I appreciated what it was. It's kind of impressive that a small amount of team, you can definitely see the love. You can see the passion in this game. And again, it gets hard. Be prepared to keep leveling your team up throughout the game. And so it kind of covers everything about Prism and Uranium, but I kind of had kind of a bonus controversy I wanted to add to the end of this one. So before we finally wrap up this longer than expected series, I wanted to briefly call attention to another controversy connected specifically to Pokemon ROM hacks. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because I still need to do more research, but I wanted to at least mention it. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what got me into this topic in the first place. So way back when I was in grad school, a couple of towns over, there was one of those like indoor-outdoor flea markets. And in this place was a game shop, like a used game store. And I found a counter full of a whole bunch of loose Game Boy Advance cartridges. A lot of them were Pokemon, and a bunch of them were Pokemon games I'd never heard of. And I actually took a picture of this that had names like Pokemon Blue Sea, Pokemon Arco Iris, which I learned is Spanish for rainbow, and Pokemon Naranja, so Pokemon Orange, and 2 different GBA versions of Pokemon Crystal, which was a game that never came out for the Game Boy Advance. My work on the show got me thinking about that again. That's what set me down this whole rabbit hole. And so you might be asking yourself, what's going on here? What are these games? What are these cartridges? It turns out, and this goes back to your question before, Kate, like, are there people aren't profiting off this? This is an example where they are. Because there's a whole cottage industry of people who scour the internet for Pokemon ROM hacks and then transfer them onto knockoff cartridges, especially Game Boy Advance cartridges, and sell them either in sketchy game stores like the one I found or online, like places like Etsy. If you go on Etsy, you'll find tons of these things. And again, remember the cardinal rule of Pokemon Fan Projects is that you can't make games for profit, although whether there's a strong defense of that is something we've talked about. But the people who sell these games ain't got no time for that. Seeing one person's carefully crafted piece of fan art as their own personal payday. And payday is a move in Pokemon. In fact, it's worth mentioning that fake cartridges are a really big problem in the retro collecting scene right now. And there are tons of examples of people selling alleged authentic cartridges online only to turn out to be knockoffs. And there's tons of places online that'll verify whether or not a game is real, like the subreddit r game verifying. And there are places that'll tell you what to look for in a real versus a fake game. It's become a real problem recently. And especially in the GBA community, Game Boy Advance cartridges, it's really easy to find fakes. Understandably, people are less than thrilled about this in the ROM hacking community because people are, on the one hand, the sellers are profiting off their work without their permission. And on the other hand, this could give the look of Nintendo to say you are actually directly profiting off these things. So it could run the whole risk of the community being in the crosshairs of Nintendo by these sort of middlemen who take that work and they make money off of it. There are places that do sell repros or reproduction cartridges where they will say up front that they are reproductions, but other places will just pass them off as real ones. Because there is actually a market, particularly with how bad the retro gaming scene has gotten price-wise, where people will sometimes just have reproductions of those cartridges so people can recreate the experience. But there are also people who are just trying to scam and take advantage of people. And sometimes ROM hackers will address this in their games. So for example, a user shared a screenshot on the Pokemon Prism subreddit of a Game Boy Color cartridge of Pokemon Prism. And when they booted up, it displayed a message that was from Cool Boy Man that said, quote, "Notice, if you paid for this game, email me immediately because you were ripped off," end quote. And we're not going to talk about repros too much because there actually is a lot of conversation and debate about repros because, again, for some people, they're a way of creating a mostly authentic experience of playing the games without having to spend like if you want to play Chrono Trigger on a Super NES, but you don't want to spend like $200 on eBay to buy an original, you can play this reproduction and kind of get a recreation of that experience kind of thing. Or like Ocarina of Time or any number of like really hard to find but are well-regarded games that you might want to play on original hardware that you can't because of cost. And for some, it's also kind of like a more economically accessible in what is already a fairly expensive hobby. So that'll be for another episode. We'll talk about that in more detail. But why don't we start wrapping up by checking back on the makers of Pokemon Prism and Pokemon Uranium and see what they've been up to lately. On December the 21st, 2017, the 1-year anniversary of Prism's takedown, Cool Boy Man reflected on his experience with a post in the game's subreddit. Overall, he viewed the whole experience positively, reflecting on how much he learned and how working on Prism helped him both as a project manager and a game developer. He also asserted he bore no ill will toward Nintendo, and even explained he felt the cease and desist notice was a blessing in disguise, relieving him of the pressure of trying to make the game perfect, to say nothing of the added stress of suddenly being thrown in the gaming spotlight. It also freed him to work on original projects and help advance his career in the games industry and take better care of his mental health. He ended by thanking the fans and promising to make new fun games in the future, concluding, quote, "It really means a lot to me that you all have stuck with me for this long. Some of you have been following me for over a decade, which I think is incredible. You people are more than numbers. You all have a lot going on in your lives as well, and I'm thankful you've decided to take time out of your day to play what I've developed. I'll do everything I can to continue to make fun games for you all. I promise to not let any of you down and continue to provide quality content," end quote. And since then, he's worked at several gaming firms, including a recent stint at Electronic Arts, which he did until March 2022. Meanwhile, JV and Involuntary Twitch recently got back into fan game development. On August the 6th, 2021, 5 years to the day they released Uranium, the pair announced that they were working on a new Pokemon fan game they called Pokémon Flux. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Built in RPG Maker XP, using Pokemon Essentials version 19, Pokemon Flux takes place in the Altera region, where Pokemon give off a powerful energy called Flux. While people use Flux to make major technological advances, not unlike they might do with nuclear energy, I'd say, they're suddenly beset by a new type of aggressive, supercharged Pokemon they call Nuclear. No, I mean Alter Pokemon. And it's up to 3 aspiring trainers to get to the bottom of it. Features in Pokemon Flux include an entirely new battle system, a new progression system that doesn't rely on gym battles, and a large Pokedex sporting Pokemon from several different regions, including Kanto, Johto, and Uranium's Tandor region. The game is being put out in episodes, and the first episode dropped on March the 5th, 2023, with the pair asserting that that's roughly the first third of the game. Whether Flux meets the same fate as Uranium, that's up for Nintendo to decide. And that is where we will finally end it. Final thoughts.
Well, I'm surprised that there were a few people who went up against Nintendo and lived to tell the tale.
Yeah, it's given me definitely a new appreciation for people who make fan games. But both like the technical expertise involved, and also just knowing that you're making something that, you know, if it gets on the wrong person's bad side, it'll just be swept away and maybe never enjoyed by anybody. So props.
On the one hand, I kind of feel good that there's a somewhat happy ending to this story, with the people who made 2 Pokemon games, at least, being able to move on happily with their lives. But the conspiracy theorist in me wonders, why are they so happy afterwards? I don't know.
Tune in for our follow-up YouTube channel where we try to break the lid open on this thing. I'm sorry, Kate, go ahead.
And Elford, to pull on one of your earlier points, I guess one of my final thoughts is it's interesting. Prior to this, I kind of always thought that like Nintendo was tightly in control of its IPs in terms of like, you're not going to see, say, Pokemon or Pikmin or Mario on non-Nintendo game systems, the way that you see certain other games that would system hop, right? Like, no, those are all Nintendo properties. The way that they kind of really crack down on people, individuals and small companies and just people who are expressing their love for the game, and the way that, I mean, like, again, the guy who they went so far as to garnish his wages in prison, and I'm certain that they didn't specifically say, and another thing, once he goes to prison we're going to take his wages there too. It's just like they overlooked that at best, right? Like at best they thought like the amount of money that we're taking from him, we're going to do that to him too, which is going to really make his life miserable, even more so than it is. You know, it's interesting that that's not more widely known. Makes me kind of rethink my love of some Nintendo properties, honestly.
I guess I underestimated what I was getting myself into when I started researching this. I thought this was, it's funny because I thought about this as, you know, pulling behind the curtain, as we finished our whole episode where we talked about Nazis. And if you want to check more about that, check out our Destructive Creations episode and our Hatred episode. And like, it's a fun palate cleanser. It'd be a simple, easy thing that'll set the tone for the rest of the year. And this has been most of my life this year. I'm putting this together. It just the amount of the twists and turns it had, a community that I kind of was vaguely aware of some of them. Like I remember when that fan translation of Silver came out when I was in high school, Vita Trans Silver, and like didn't realize that that was part of like this other bigger community, and the amount of just how deep this went was something that I was really shocked and really surprised by. And it's like, at this point, there's like nothing else I can't say that I haven't already said, but just like the fact that one, this shows a lot of people would not spend the amount of time working on these types of games and, you know, pouring through assembly language. And Phil and Kate have talked about how much of a pain in the ass that is to do. If they didn't really...
I don't want to derail, so now we all got to go. Do people really program in assembly to do this?
Some do. They don't do it that much anymore, but like
that's insane. That's like, I can paint the house with a paintbrush or a Q-tip, and I'm using a Q-tip. That's just, you know.
But yeah, so some people, like, they loved it so much that they wanted to go into assembly language and make their own Pokemon games, which is a level of commitment that I would never have. But like, and then people go into like, we're going to make our own Pokemon and we're going to make an entirely new game based on, like, that's extraordinary, the amount of work and just the amount of complicated intellectual property conversations that brings up, and like, what right do they have that? And like, at the same point, this like, there's a certain level of like a company like Nintendo could kind of ride on the popularity of some of these, like say FromSoft does when they let the gaming press talk about mods that talk more about Elden Ring and things like that. And it's like, it is an intersection of a lot of different conversations that I did not expect we were going to go into. And so I'm excited for us to be going into new topics, although I warn you that the next topic we're going to is a fairly heavy one as we celebrate our 2nd anniversary of doing this.
Woohoo!
But until next time, that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Sequel by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Phil Thomas.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Elford Stephens.
I'm Kate.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.
Well, I guess it's just us cats. And then there was one. Do, 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 do. Oh, what a night. Do, 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 down in 65. Do, 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 never die. What a lady, what a night. What these guys don't know is I work for Nintendo. I've got my eye on you.
Alfred, I still had my headphones on. I just heard everything you sang.
That was a little Easter egg for Kevin.
That was hilarious. I hope it makes it into the episode.